Welcome to Modern Anarchy, the podcast featuring real conversations with conscious objectors to the status quo. I'm your host, Nicole.
I tried to keep her quiet, but she's screaming inside of me. I tried to keep her hiding, oh, shut up. I tried to keep her quiet, but she's a wild, wild woman.
On today's episode, we have sex educator Damian join us for a conversation about the pleasure we all deserve. Together, we talk about the taboo topic of sexuality for people with a disability, how American sex education is worse than other countries. Is that shocking anyone? I mean, come on at this point on this show. And the medicine of laughter. Y'all, this was such a lovely conversation with Damian. And I appreciated how we talked about the reality that there needs to be more conversations about sex and disability. Damian talked about how many play spaces and kink dungeons aren't accessible. And as he said that, I thought about the ones that I know in Chicago. And I definitely know one which is completely not accessible at all for anybody who is unable to use stairs. And so I asked myself and people in my community and in your own local communities, who can we talk to about this? Where can we start to have these conversations so that we can change this reality and make pleasure equitable? And Damian also talked about the art of communication and how it is so crucial to have better, deeper, more intimate sex. And I just really want to underline that, right? We talk about pleasurable sex on this podcast, and a lot of sex educators talk about that. But when do we talk about the communication, right? And how crucial that is to feel safe, to feel comfortable in your connection, to play and be open and dynamic with another human. And maybe AI, right? One day, Jesus. What a world, what a world. But the reality is that if you're going to be having anal play, then you should feel comfortable talking about hemorrhoids, okay? Because we're all human and it all happens. And there doesn't have to be shame about all of these things. We need to be able to talk about pleasure in a way that also allows us to talk about the other pieces that come with that and the human noises, the different experiences, juices that might come out of your body, right? When we can let go of the shame around our very normal and natural humanness, what I will tell you is that allows so much more space for you to play, to be open, and to enjoy yourself and to feel that pleasure. So I really appreciated Damian coming on the podcast and sharing about his passion, about his lived experience, and calling us all to a better world where pleasure is more equitable. I hope y'all enjoy today's episode and tune in. Well then, yeah, let's start. So how would you introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Damian. I am a sex educator who is disabled. I'm disabled. I am known for having a bright pink wheelchair. Usually wear bright pink trainers as well. You can't see them today. Today I am in a Volbeat t-shirt because one of my favorite bands. And my background is books with sex education and loads of nerdy stuff. I'm a white, cis male, brown hair, bit thinning, with glasses.
Beautiful, beautiful. And it's a pleasure to have you today. I'm excited
Thank
for
you
all.
so much for having me.
Yeah, I'm excited for all the things we're going to talk about. So I think one of the first questions I'd like to ask guests on the show is, what are you passionate about?
I'm very passionate about making things more equal. I think we all, like, from a sex education point of view and talking about pleasure-based sex education and things, I think we need to talk about everyone being able to have that. As someone who's disabled, I see it so often that disabled people are left out of this topic. For me, sex and disability is the last big taboo. Most people see it as like disabled people don't have sex, they shouldn't have sex, they shouldn't have children, they shouldn't have relationships. And for me, that's an absolute load of bullshit. We should all be entitled to pleasure. So that is something I'm very passionate about. And I like to talk to adults, young adults as well, about how we have these conversations and how we can make a difference.
Absolutely. And that's so needed in this space. Like you said, one of the last taboos. Could you say more about that? How is this one of the taboos?
I think it's because it's just not seen in mainstream media. It's not seen in mainstream porn. This is something I will definitely talk about. I think I was diagnosed when I was in my teens. So growing up, I was kind of like, how's it going to affect me? How's it going to affect my sex life, relationships? And I speak to so many people like that. Like I get stories all the time about how people who are in the like 50s and 60s now, who were basically told in their teens, sex education isn't for you. You won't have sex. And
Wow.
and you still hear it now, and it's so upsetting to hear it now. I speak to like people in their like late teens, early 20s who just feel maybe sex isn't for me because I don't see it in the mainstream.
Mm.
So even like in mainstream media, there was for me growing up, there wasn't a lot of disabled people on TV. My condition has changed as I've got older. I'm now in a wheelchair, as I said. But when you talk to people who've been in wheelchair since they were children, they've had no one to look up to. And then you put this into a like sex education setting or erotica or anything like that. If you don't see it, you can't relate to it.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, we're such social creatures. We're always looking to other people for examples of how to live our life, what it means to be human, how to interact with other people. And so you're hitting on such an important thing that when there's not media representation of your existence, then there's no models for how to do this. And like you said, it creates this taboo then where people don't talk about it.
Yeah, and there's so much. You look at the adult industry, for example. You look sex toys, porn, swingers clubs, things like that. Most of it isn't accessible. So disabled people taken away from it straight away. My background, like I worked in the sex toy industry for nearly 20 years. I set
Wow.
my own business completely by accident, but which is a weird story. But
I want to hear it. Yeah, tell
so I
me.
finished university and I did a degree in criminology. And I thought, right, what am I going to do? Always been
Mm.
obsessed with crime and things like that. But I'd had enough of learning. My disability was causing some issues. So I was, right, what am I going to do? And I set up a online store selling gifts, gadgets, went to a trade fair in the UK, and there was a stand selling vibrating rubber ducks. It's an American company called Big T's Toys. I rubbed my ducky, and I saw them and I thought, oh, that's a great fun bit. And the two men who were running the stall were like talking to me, and they said, oh, if you want to see something else, we've got other stuff behind the screen. And they had Fun Factory sex toys. And I was
Mm.
like, wow. And this is going back to about 2004, 2005. So still very taboo, really, with sex toys. And so I decided to start selling them online. And it became apparent very quickly most sex toys weren't accessible. I struggled with a lot of them because I have poor hand dexterity. So I was struggling pressing buttons, holding them, things like that.
Mm.
So as time went on, it was like there's a massive hole in the market. So I started spending a lot of time researching products, looking for stuff that was accessible. And over the years, I decided just to only sell what I deemed were accessible products. But now I've closed my stores, which was a sad thing. And
Mm.
that only happened at the back end of last year. But I'm now working with sex toy companies and sex education outlets more in an education way. And I'm helping sex toy companies make their products more accessible. And there's so many brands out there that need to do this. There's some that are already trying to do it, and hopefully they'll do it in a good way. And there's some brands that are already doing it in a good way, but the more need to do it. It's such a big market. The purple pound is huge. Masturbation might be the only way some disabled people get any pleasure. They
Mm.
might not be able to have penetrative sex for many reasons. So masturbation might be the only way. So if we can make that accessible, it's a good thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's so important that everyone deserves to be able to have pleasure in their body and have that. So I think you're doing such amazing work to make that more accessible for other people.
Yeah, and thank you. It's just I think so many people are left out of it,
Mm.
and it can be little things like it can be positional pillows and things like that, or even using a restraints in different ways. You've got to always look outside the box. So, for example, if you've got someone who can't physically turn themselves over, you can use a spreader bar to do that in a gentle way. So you don't always have to look at what the product is meant for. There might be a different way of using it. So if we can have these conversations, go to companies and say, right, this is what we need to do. And it can be even the simple things such as packaging is so inaccessible at times. So you start from the beginning, work out. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So that people can be able to have that pleasure. I mean, I feel like
Yeah.
this should be a basic human right? To
Yeah.
have
Or like
that.
things like, yeah, even like looking at your background, I can see the harness on the
Yes.
mannequin. That will be so inaccessible to so many people if they've got hand dexterity issues. So it's even talking to lingerie companies and bondage equipment companies to try and say, right, change the buckle or change how it fastens. And yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, all of these little pieces so that more people can play and more people can be in touch with their erotic selves and have that pleasure. That's so important.
Yeah. And it's having these conversations from an early age. Like, if you don't have these conversations in schools, so in the UK, sex education is compulsory, but
Mm.
it depends how, like in some schools can kind of opt out for it in different ways, but you're supposed to have it.
Hmm.
But there's certain things you can't talk about. So for example, you can't tell the pupils what the clitoris is for. You can tell them where it is, but you are not allowed to tell them what it's for.
What? Why? Why?
Because it can be seen to be encouraging them. Because if you tell them it's a pleasurable thing, you could be seen to be encouraging them to play with it.
Which would be
Yeah, exactly.
bad? What?
Yeah. So turn it up a notch. There's been a story in the UK UK press this week of a school banning touching. So 2 schools have banned touching. They said they will have a no touch rule in the school, and children, so no hugging, no holding hands, no relationships. It's just so detrimental to how they are going to function when they grow up. I know we have to have more lessons about boundaries and consent, but going that full extreme is only a negative. And I think if you then put people who are neurodivergent into that conversation, it's going to be so hard to explain why there's these boundaries. So we need to be more open with these conversations, not closing them down.
Right, and preventing people from touch? What? When did this become the world that we're in where you can't hug another person?
Exactly. I'm a hugger. I'm a hugger, and I know not everyone is, but I think you teaching kids that they shouldn't be hugging, not a good thing.
Right, because that oxytocin release, that connection, that regulation between bodies when we're connecting is so important. I'm really shocked that they would do that. I mean, and the crazy part too is when you start to ban things like that, I feel like it almost just sparks up the desire in a whole different way. When you tell someone you can't do this, then everyone's like, well, I want to do it now, you know?
Yeah, it's mental. It really is. The conversations we need now need to be more about consent, boundaries, how everyone is different, but we all have different kinks, fetishes. Yes, we've got to be careful what conversations you have at certain ages, but as they get older, you can introduce this a little bit more. And talking about pleasure, obviously, is, as you know, I do work with the Pleasure Project because Anne got me on here.
Hell yeah.
We need to be talking about pleasure in so much more in safe settings.
Yeah. It makes me want to ask too, yeah, what was your sex education like? What was your discussion of
Non-existent.
Yeah, I was gonna say, what was your discussion of pleasure?
Non-existent. My sex education at school was a little bit of a biology lesson, condom on a banana, which is, you ask most people in the UK what their sex education, and that is it. And I think the rest I learned reading. I don't know how much in the US you had, but we had a lot of lads mags, so like FHM, Loaded. So they weren't adult magazines; they were like aimed at young adults and maybe older, but they were they would have celebrities in and in skimpy underwear, and they would have sex tips and things like that. And I read a lot of them in my like 14 upwards. And then obviously porn. Different was back then because it was on VHS. It wasn't even on DVD when I was like in
Right.
my teens. So it was very different. But I look now, it's not how you should be getting your sex education. We need to be having open discussions. There's some great sex educators on Instagram and other like social media channels, but even so, you see them getting clamped down on now. Like so many are losing their accounts because they're having these open conversations. So coming onto places like this and talking, it's amazing.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be able to hold space for conversations like this because, yeah, it's always so wild to me. It's like we can't talk about sex and sexuality, and I understand, the desire to protect people from, non-consensual discussions about that or things, like, so I don't, I get all spun up by this where it's like the reality is all of us came from sex. And I feel like we forget that piece where it's like, I'm here because two people had sex. You're here because people had sex, right? I mean, and yet we can't talk about it. And I just feel so just, I don't understand anymore why this is the world that we live in today.
Yeah, like you said, we are. Someone had to have sex for us to be here. I know like times are changing, and
That's a good
we,
point. We could talk about in vitro
yeah,
fertilization. Yeah.
but you go back to the beginning, we all because of sex.
Yeah.
It's like the whole thing about nudity as well, and embracing our bodies. It's crazy how much censorship goes on still. We all come into the world with no clothes on.
Hmm.
It's how nature is. So we shouldn't be ashamed of that.
Right. And even just to have conversations about it. I recorded with someone where we were talking about porn and I had made the title like porn, 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 and it got blocked on YouTube. And I was like, did anyone actually listen to the audio? There's not even a visual component to it, right? It was purely audio, and yet it was still banned. And I was like, why? Right? It's just that word, even. I guess that
Yeah.
porn word is such a signifier for YouTube to like take it down, even though it was purely educational content with no video content that could have been like, oh, you were showing things or anything like that, still getting banned. And I tried to contest that ban and they still came back. So I had to change the title to make it more like and re-upload it. But it's just like, why is this the system that we live in? Why?
Yeah. When you look at Instagram algorithms and things, and you can't even say the word sex, and you look at all the words that sex educators are using as alternatives, it's like it's a word. It's harming no one. Why are you getting rid of it? And I understand the platforms now like being careful with what they're allowed on in the sense of
Right.
visuals, but
Right.
words, I don't really see the problem.
Right. Because at that point, it's education,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, it's educating, especially when you look at like if you're talking about, for example, let's talk about like we're talking about safe sex, for example, and if I'm talking about how it can be hard for someone with dexterity issues to put a condom on,
Hmm.
and I would potentially show a demonstration. I know that could be taken off if that is done in the wrong way, but it's done for an educational way.
I call that a collective trauma personally, that we've all experienced this ban on sex education and how that is all affecting us because all this is rooted in shame, right? You can't talk about this, this is taboo, and all of that. And then we're lacking the education that we all deserve to have to be able to experience more pleasure in our lives and to be able to do these different things. I just don't really understand how we're still here.
Yeah, and if we don't have these open conversations, it's like I can't remember the number off the top of my head. I know there's statistics out there that show disabled people who don't talk about sex are more likely to be abused if they haven't had sex education. And there's so many disabled people who have been sexually abused
Mm.
and they're more likely to be abused because of disability. So we need to have we need to talk about sex and education to provide a safety net for them as well and tell them, you know, to love their own bodies, no
Mm.
matter what their disability is, love their own bodies. someone will always love, like, if you don't love yourself, that you've got to start there. And also then show what is wrong as well. So they can know about consent, no means no, things like that. And I think that is why it's so important that we have these conversations now, because if we don't, there's going to be again another lost generation. And you ask me what I'm passionate about, that is what it is. I speak to so many people who've had no sex education because of their disabilities, and it's shocking. I did a talk a little while back, and it was what I wish I'd known. I do with a company in the UK called Split Banana. We're a sex education company, and we run sessions, and we ask people where they got the sex education from and what they wish they'd known. And we did a session last year, and it was attended really well by quite a lot of Americans. And the education there seemed even worse for disabled people than it is
Not
in
shocking.
the UK.
Tell me more. Yeah.
Because there were so many people who were coming out, and they had, like, literally, we were talking about how, again, porn and mainstream, like, how there is nothing. The only time you really see disability in porn is fetishized, and again, you've got the risk with devotees and things like that, and some people get really upset with all them conversations. So you've got to have the conversation, tell them, like, it's not always a bad thing. Some people with devotees are quite happy, but because they don't see it in, like, when it's fetishized, they're kind of worried that that is what a relationship's going to be like. And I had a conversation with a lady from America. I think she was in her 50s, and she'd had no sex education whatsoever. So she was kind of coming to the session asking us questions, basic things, which was just shocking.
Absolutely. I mean, when we think about the history of America and we think about that, the people who came over to, colonize this land and appropriately, they were the Puritans. They were the most stringent of religious sects that, decided, like, let's build a new colony over here, right? And so when we think about that history of, like, the deep, deep repression of sexuality and all of that, I think, like, when we think about how America got to a place where maybe the education is worse than the UK, like, that might be part of the story for us.
What was your sex education like?
That's a great question. I went to a Christian school growing up, and so I didn't get sex education. I got abstinence education in terms of you should not have sex until you're married. There's lots of STDs, and I never got the condom over the banana. So I never knew how to put on like, you could kind of know, but, like, I never knew how to do that. And so I actually wouldn't say I got any sex education. Rather, I got an abstinence education where I was taught that if I were to have sex with someone, it would be like bringing two pieces of paper together with glue. Have you seen that one?
No, I haven't.
Oh, yeah. They showed us all in an assembly. They were like, when you have sex with someone, you bring these two pieces of paper together, and then they try to separate the two pieces of paper, and then you saw it kind of rip, and some of it was over there, and they were like, when you have sex with someone and then leave, this is what happens to you. You lose parts of yourself, and you are no longer whole.
That's crazy.
That was my sex education. And so then we were told, you wait until marriage, because that's what a right, especially as someone who's socially conditioned as a woman, that's what a right woman does. I wait for my husband to marry me one day, and I will give him this gift of my virginity.
Yeah, that's nuts.
Isn't that wild?
Yeah, that just could not be, like, so far from the truth. But yeah.
Exactly. And so then, a lot of people probably had that. Maybe that woman that, you mentioned, that 50-year-old, maybe that's what she heard. Depending on where you were at and what sort of context, you might have gotten a wide range of different topics on this, from nothing to a little bit of something. Maybe it sounds like you got kind of something, but even then, not enough of the education that we all need, and the expansive education that includes different abilities, different types of relationships, different types of sexual orientations. I mean, we're just so lacking in this area. It's insane.
Yeah, I was lucky because both my parents were nurses, so I was lucky that conversations were quite open about things like that anyway. But I have friends who just would never have been able to have them conversations with their parents. But you go down like the porn route now,
Mhm.
like when I was alluding to it before, I think this is another problem we have, like with disability, because, like I say, it isn't shown.
Right.
It should be shown. I'd love to see more porn companies tackle the subject, and I've
Yeah.
talked to some about it. It's not easy because it's
Mm.
got to make sure it's not fetishized.
Mhm.
Um, have you heard of the website Make Love Not Porn?
Mm-mm.
So Make Love Not Porn is a website that is real world sex. That is
Lovely.
how it is described, and it's amazing because there's videos on there of people just in their own environment, filming themselves. You see things go right, you see things go wrong, and I
Mm.
love that. And there is a couple on there. Man is in a wheelchair, and to see that in a raw form
Mm.
is really inspiring. It's like you see it, and you can use that in the sense of, look, this can be done. And I think if we saw more companies do this,
Mhm.
I think I love the term real world sex. I just think that's how we need porn. Porn has its place, but there is so much wrong with it at times, and I think we need to look for the good stuff.
Mhm.
So if there's companies who out there who will talk about disability, I like I think we need to have them. It's always going to be hard to get people to star in them because they're going to be worried about being fetishized
Mm.
or if it's not done in a good way. But I
Yeah.
think that is something that needs to happen.
And when you're bringing that to companies, are they hearing you out on this? Or are they what's their response to you when you come to
Some of the
them?
companies are quite like they're open to the conversation in the sense of they know it needs to happen.
Uh-huh.
The problem is they don't know the way to do it, and
Mm.
it's finding the people who are willing to be in the films as well,
Yeah.
because you've got to lay yourself completely out for everyone to see.
Mhm.
I know there is some people who've done it, especially like with gay videos, and I think we just need to see more gay, lesbian, everything. We need to see with disability involved in the
Mhm.
way to show that. I think because it's so hard for disabled people to like lay themselves bare and open to, because like you become desensitized. Desensitized maybe isn't the word, but you've like lock yourself away. A lot of I know it's hard to talk about disability. So many disabled people don't like talking about it. I love talking about it. I love talking
Mhm.
about but it depends on your relationships, for example, as well. If you've had abuse, you're going to struggle to talk about it. If you've not been in a relationship, you want that, it's hard to go and find it. But also, you always worried about how your disability is going to impact a
Right.
relationship. I like in my teens, I'm really lucky. I met my wife when
Aw.
I was 19, and we've been together for 23 years.
Mm.
I was diagnosed with my condition when I was 14. I have a condition called Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, and it affects my joints. I dislocate very easily, things like that. I have other conditions as well. But she's seen everything with me. So she's seen me in hospital, she's seen me having to have treatments. I feel really blessed, lucky that I have had that.
Oh.
Not everyone gets that. But I also had the conversations about even how would my disability affect like me grow as I get older, what strain that might put on a relationship.
Yeah.
um and I've had them conversations with Ali lots, and you still some days you put a lot on yourself because you think you rely on someone else quite a lot.
Mm.
So when you then bring that into a relationship from an like a start, that is not easy. And I remember having them conversations as a 19-year-old and saying, right,
Mhm.
I don't know how my condition will affect as I get older. So it could affect
Mm.
sex, it could affect the relationship, it could affect like me having to be pushed around in a wheelchair. So I think again, this goes back to an education setting. We need to have discussions with people who would say, and able-bodied people. This is the important thing as well. I think we need to talk about disability, even if there's no one disabled in the class. This is where we stop the whole thing of disabled people shouldn't be having sex.
Yep.
I have so many people that I know who are disabled who believe they have a better sex life because of their disability.
Mm. Hell yeah.
because that you have to have more conversations. You have to talk about it more. The art of conversation in the bedroom seems to have died, but when you have to have it and say, I'd be comfier if I'm doing this, or this is better. Let's have these conversations. It's
Yeah.
better for everyone, not just for disabled people, better for everyone.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I want to thank you for sharing your experience with this with your wife as well, having those conversations. What was that like when you first started to have that compared to maybe where you're at today?
Uh, really hard because
Mm,
I was very shy as a teenager. I'm not now. Most people know me for just talking for England.
yeah.
And obviously I talk about sex all the time.
Mm-hmm.
But I couldn't then. I was very different then. But it was just one of them conversations having, and it also put doubt in my mind. It was like, at any point, would she want to walk away? And I've even
Um,
had them conversations. Look, like, this is how my disability might affect me. If you want to go, go now. And
mm,
yeah, and it's hard to admit and say I've done that, but I had to do it like that in my head as a 19-year-old. It was like, I just don't know what's going to happen.
yeah.
And if it's a lot, and like I say, we've been together 23 years, and she's
Oh.
seen the good and the bad and the ugly with me. Like,
Mm,
it's yeah, I say I feel lucky, blessed.
yeah.
Oh,
To have someone where you can be that open about all of your fears, right? At that moment, all the things that are out of your control, and to ask for connection and intimacy in that time, and then to receive it for many, many years is such a
yeah.
beautiful thing.
And people often ask me, like, about different things, about why, like, how you deal with certain things, and I do say laughing. Laughing helps. Because as I was saying about, like, and this is something else we should have more discussions in sex education. It doesn't always look like it does in the movies or in porn. Things can go wrong. I have often dislocated my joints
Mm,
during sex. Can be painful, but you've
mhm,
got to laugh it off. And if you don't, it's just going to be sat in the back of your head that it's going to happen again and again, and it probably will. But
mhm,
you just got to, and I think we need to have these conversations. Noises, sounds, like it all happens.
mhm,
So we just need
mhm.
to go with the flow.
Yeah, we all have bodies that are going to make, yeah, different noises, different things that come out, and being able to normalize that and then laugh. I mean, for you too, thinking about if you're very shy and uncomfortable talking about sex at the beginning, to getting to a space where you can laugh about it. That is a journey. What do you feel like the stepping stones were to getting to that space? Because I'm sure you can imagine that's probably hard for that younger self you who was so uncomfortable to start laughing about these things. There's just no way, Damien, I couldn't do that?
Yeah, I think it's just being able to have someone around you that you can have that open,
Mm,
don't care, have no filter, and be willing to listen as well.
mm,
I think in a relationship you need to listen. Goes both ways. You've got to give, got to take. And I'm lucky I've got that. I'm trying to think if there was a specific thing, but no, I would say it's just being open. And
yeah.
that is something I think it's hard to, I still close off with certain, like, it's growing up, I found it hard to be, like, quite open. I'm neurodiverse, so sometimes dealing with other people isn't always easy.
Hmm.
And it's just being able to have a natural conversation as much as you can.
Hmm.
And it's not always easy, but I think that's what we need to do. We need to just take each other for what we are.
Hmm.
We don't do that enough. We put filters up. And social media is like a prime example of that. You can only see what someone wants you to see.
Right.
And I
Right.
think sometimes you've got to bring that down and be a little bit more vulnerable, which isn't always
Hmm.
easy. Yeah.
Yeah, yes, because we're all looking for connection, right? That even from like a deep evolutionary sense of being a part of the herd, being connected, that's what gave us safety. And so we're always looking for what that connection piece is. But if there's an aspect of ourself that we feel like is gonna disconnect us from other people, then we'll hide that, right? And those aspects might be things that, aren't talked about enough in society, aren't modeled enough. All those pieces, we start to hide that and don't want to talk about it and feel shame about these aspects because it might limit our connection with other people, which is what we all deeply crave. And, like you said, being vulnerable about those pieces and finding places where you feel safe, I think is one of the important aspects of this, thinking about it in terms of, our nervous system, when we're activated from danger, especially given something like sexuality, where we haven't had enough conversation about it. So you're stepping into a place where, like, I don't really know what's going on. I've seen some examples on porn, but I still don't really know. And some of those examples on porn don't model my body, my abilities. So now I really don't know. And then you got that fight, flight, freeze going on because we've just haven't had enough conversations about this, haven't seen enough modeling. And so to step into a place where you can play, to feel safe, there has to be so much regulation of your body to really feel that safety connection so that you can be with the other person and giggle and laugh about all the different ways. It's that somatic experience of connecting with another person and relaxing, feeling safe enough to explore, to be a kid on the playground,
Yeah, and I think if we can, as a society, we need to be more open to, like, not judging as much. I mean, we just need to, like, when you see someone with a disability, like, if you see someone in a wheelchair, a lot of people are going to say, oh, they won't have a sex life, for example.
Mm,
Or it's society that is more of the disabling factor in some respects.
yeah.
As we were discussing about how we need to, like, break these barriers down. So, for example, I've had someone contact me a little while back about they wanted to go to a swingers club, a sex club, swingers club,
Hmm.
but they couldn't find any that would take them because they were in a wheelchair.
Wow.
So I did a lot of research and looking into this, and it's something I'm currently working on, but it is really hard to find. A lot of clubs just will not let you in if you've got a disability
Wow.
because they just feel it's tricky because some disabled people will be there with a carer, for example, or rather than a partner. But so you've got to bring that into it as well. But so many of them just aren't accessible. They're not wheelchair accessible. They don't have disabled toilets. They don't have things like that. And
Yeah.
so you are kind of alienating them straight away. So then that person feels like they're not a part of what they want, of this part of society that they want to be. Why should you be stopped from exploring your sexuality or just because you're disabled?
Yeah. That's wrong.
Yeah. And that's what kind of the lack of sex education does, because, like, if an able-bodied person thinks disabled people don't have sex, they're not going to approach them. They're not going to know how to approach them, for example, to have them conversations. Now, on the flip side, you get a lot of disabled people who are asked, well, can you have sex? And things like that, and in the most inappropriate ways.
Mm.
Um, I don't say necessarily I've had it, but my wife has had people ask her about the conversations about us
Wow.
because they see me as a disabled person. So,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. How does that make you feel?
I usually, like, like I said, I will have these open conversations and say, look, we can have sex, it's fine. But what people sometimes forget is sex isn't just about penetration either. For example, if you've got a spinal cord injury and you can't get an erection, there's other ways that you can be pleasured or pleasure someone. And this is, again, all goes back to education.
Mm-hmm.
Filters back. It all, for me, it stems back to that one thing. And that's why looking at, like, sex toys, for example, looking at how sex toys can be used in different ways or how they can be used for pleasure, like even using, like, there's more technology now. So toys can be activated with apps and things like that. You can use it over the internet. So there's ways how you can use that technology for someone with a disability. So,
Mm-hmm.
and that's how we've got to have these open open and frank conversations. I'd be interested to know how many people, when they had their sex education, if disability was ever mentioned. I probably would say it'd be less than 1%.
Yeah. And that's exactly how then we get to those scenarios of, yeah, people asking inappropriate questions to your wife, or the situation of, that swinger or kink play space that is not accessible to all people.
Yeah. And it's also about quite often in the UK press, when you talk about disability and sex, the first thing that is always brought up is using a sex worker. For
Mm,
some reason,
interesting.
a lot of a lot of press believe that a disabled person would have to use a sex worker, and I don't know why that is. Yes, they may want to use, but it shouldn't be. That shouldn't be the only way that society believes that a
Wow.
disabled person would have sex.
Yeah, because the assumption is what there.
Basically, that they disabled people don't have relationships. That's what it boils down to, basically.
Yeah. Thinking even deeper about like all the really problematic assumptions that I think are wrapped up in that assumption there.
Yeah.
Oof.
I don't agree with inappropriate conversations, but I think we need to have these conversations.
Mm,
They need to be in the right environment, in the right space, a safe space, but we
yes.
need to so many people just don't have these conversations.
Yes. We're not having enough of these conversations for sure. Right. And
Yeah.
that's why I'm so thankful for the work that you're doing, the powerful work that you're doing to bring these conversations into light and to be talking with big corporations about producing more, expansive porn. I mean, that will literally change the world, change people's ability to be in connection with other people and create a more safe space for people to access pleasure.
Yeah, even to see it would be amazing in some respects, like to see in some good porn that was made with people with either who were in a wheelchair. Like I said, there is stuff out there that has been self-done,
Mhm.
like I say, on Make Love Not Porn, but to see more, even in mainstream media, on telly, even to see sex scenes with
Yes.
there is very little out there. There's
Yes.
odd thing that in Sex Education there was a character, but there's not enough. We need to see
Yeah.
more and more of it.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I recently watched the HBO show Sex Lives of College Girls. Have you seen
Yeah,
that? Yeah, as I
I've
say.
only seen little bits of it.
Okay, yeah, they had one of the main characters. She was someone with a disability, and she was just one of the most like sexual badass characters in the whole show. She was like, "Yeah, I'm having sex with people left and right," and I was like, "Yes, this is
Yeah,
the representation we need to be seeing for these
yeah,
things."
we need the representation of like disabled people. Disabled people can be sexy. They are sexy. There's some stunning disabled people
Yes.
around. We need to see them more on the covers of magazines and on the TV. And this is how we break this taboo down.
Hmm.
It's hard. It's so hard because I understand why there's reservations about it still, in the sense of we've been programmed for so many years. Like there's still countries that just basically people with disabilities are pushed in basically into a cupboard and not talked about, and it still goes on. We need to break that down. I had conversations with people in different countries talking about sex education, and when I always ask the question of what sex education is there for disabled people, well, you don't really see disabled people. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, you've identified the problem right
yeah,
there. Oh,
yeah. When I'm talking to schools and sex education facilitators in the UK, there's basically no one talking about it.
mm. Mm.
So I'm quite happy to have these conversations. If anyone wants to reach out and talk to me, just drop me a line.
Yes.
We need to talk about it more.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that will change the world. People deserve to have that pleasure. And yeah, we're sifting through so many taboos here. Like you said, one of the last taboos, especially in a sexuality space, to be talking about disability and to be advocating for more representation. That is such needed work.
It's hard because, like, society is still inaccessible for a lot of disabled people. Like,
Yes.
you even basic things, for example, like travel and going to certain buildings, it's still inaccessible. And we need to start making everything accessible as much as we can. And I know it's also explaining to people as well. You may not be disabled now, but you have a high chance as you get older of having a disability of some sort. So
Mhm.
it might not affect you now. It will affect you at some point potentially. And if it's not you, it'll be someone you know. So again, this is something I talk about quite often is it's so hard, especially talking about sex. Someone who acquires a disability, and this might be from an accident, they kind of just get left and they don't know how. I speak to so many men, especially, who've had injuries that has then affected their sex life, and no one has had a conversation with them in the hospital or doctors or
Oh,
anyone has had a conversation about how their sex life will be affected.
wow. Wow. Mm.
So you speak to people and they'll say, "Oh, that's it. I'm not going to have a sex life anymore." They might not be how it was, but there is a way, still a way. So we need to have the conversation. What works for you? And I've sat
Mhm.
down with couples with some of the work that I've done with different charities in the UK, and we sit down and talk to couples and or even like men, women on their own as well, and have the conversation about how there'll be a different way of having some sort of pleasure. Because that's
Yes.
what it's about. It's about pleasure. It doesn't
Mm.
have to be, the word sex is always it's pleasure. Let's
Yes.
go to pleasure and yeah,
Yes, yes, because like we've talked about, that idea of sex can be so restrictive to such a small window of what that means. And so,
yeah,
yeah, expanding it out to pleasure, to finding that in your life and it being absolutely possible.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Because we all deserve it.
Yes, and then some. My God, you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah. Um, it's one of them common things I can talk about for so long. Again, I think if we just break it down, it's just being honest, open, willing to listen, willing to give feedback, and we can change the world. It'll take a
yeah.
long time, but we can hopefully eventually get there.
Yes, yes, one conversation at a time, one connection with a person, and all of the ripples that that can produce through doing even that small local work and how it ripples out like that. I mean, especially in a global age with connection like the internet, you can do really powerful work through just starting with
Yeah.
one person.
I talk about sex toys all the time, but it's like you don't have to potentially use them how they're used. It's like
Mm.
using a cock ring on your fingers, for example, as just sensitive touch down someone's neck, down someone's arms,
Yeah.
just to introduce that sort of touch to see how they like it. And then, like I say, I'm very big advocate of using restraints in different ways. It might be you might be able to use it to hold someone on top in a better way rather than you've just got to think outside the box.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes. And in terms of activism for both able-bodied and disabled-bodied people, like what would you recommend in terms of being a part of the movement to bring this change? Like, is what can we do to help make this a reality?
Oh, that's a tricky one.
I know.
Yeah, that is a tricky one. I think going out then and being willing to talk to someone about it.
Mm.
So, like, if you've got friends who have a disability, don't just come out and say, "Oh, do you have sex?" But ask them in a maybe bring the conversation about like how it affects them in a like how their disability affects them in a day-to-day life, and then maybe get to that eventually. But don't just come out and say, "Well, because you're in a wheelchair, that means you can't have sex," because that isn't usually the case. A wheelchair is great as a bondage device. You can, strap yourself to it, off you go.
Oh
Hoists,
yeah.
hoists are great sex swings. You've got to think outside the box. Just be willing to talk, listen,
Hmm.
don't judge. Take what society's put into your head about disability and let it go. And then just have an honest conversation. I'm happy for most people to ask me anything. Like you might not always get an answer, but I'm not going to easily get offended. Some people aren't like that. So just baby steps. Just
Yeah.
and open the conversation.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I feel inspired after this conversation to go into the local kink play spaces and ask, like, what is the accessibility like for in this
Yeah.
space, thinking about that example of someone who wanted to go to one and couldn't, even being able to start having conversations if you're a part of that scene in your local community of asking, what is the accessibility in this space for other people, other bodies?
Yeah, and it's getting in touch with places and having an open conversation as well and saying, look, I want to come. Don't expect to just turn up. I think you've got to always be open. It shouldn't be like that. You should be able to just turn up somewhere, but the way society is, you can't do that. So be open to, like, put what your requirements are. And some places will help accommodate you, hopefully. It doesn't just have to be like sex clubs and kink places. Even going into like a sex store to buy toys, it might not be always accessible
You're right.
because if you've got steps to get in and things like that. I was in New York last year and I went to the Sex Museum. They were amazing with me. I was in my wheelchair. I let them know I was coming and they managed to get me around the
Yeah.
building. But prior to I went, their lift wasn't working. So I wouldn't have been able to go if the lift wasn't working. So it's things like that. And these things happen.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also, I think, having staff in stores with a knowledge of accessibility and disability as well, and products that may work, may not work. That's not an easy thing because you can't teach everyone about every disability. But I think it's having at least a little basic knowledge, for example, about like one of the things I spoke about before was, for example, condoms. It's not easy to put a condom on if you've got dexterity issues. So again, go back to the education setting, see if there's a ways around it. There's brands out there that have applicator rings and things that do make it easier.
Okay.
But also, like, for example, using positional furniture like liberator wedges and things like that. Explain how that can change your body shape or make it comfier.
Yeah.
Maybe using restraints if you have spasms and things like that. If you've got someone who has a little bit of knowledge, and again, there is some people on the internet who do talk about this, and I think we need to have more conversations like this. So again, anyone has any questions, just drop me a line.
Yes, and thank you for offering that and being, a leader in this space to change and create, more pleasure for all bodies, more pleasure for all bodies. Thank
Yeah.
you. Yeah. Are you feeling like there's anything else that maybe you wanted to hit on today as we come towards the end of our time? Otherwise, I have a closing question, but I like to leave a little bit of space in case something was on your chest that you waned to share that we didn't get
No,
to.
I think we've covered a lot.
Good.
Otherwise, you're going to get at least another hour out of this. So I think we better go for the closing.
Hey, the world needs it. If anything from our conversation, I think this conversation should be 3+ hours, right? My
Yes.
God. Yeah. Well, then the question that I ask everyone on the podcast is, what is one thing that you wish other people knew was more normal?
I think it just would have to be that disabled people have sex. End of. Or can have sex and want pleasure and to be loved. End of.
Yeah, right? Because that would prevent all those intrusive questions, those assumptions, all those problematic aspects of, the current society about sex and the current assumptions we have with people who have disabilities. That alone, if we could normalize that, we would be in a completely different world.
Yeah, it's just normal in conversations about disability full stop. But that you drop sex in there as well. Explosion of, I wouldn't say shame because it's not a shame. It's like a bit of an embarrassment to have these conversations. People don't want to have them. Let's get rid of that.
Yeah.
World will be a nicer place.
Yes, yes, full of more pleasure. And when people are pleasured, I would say we're happy, joyful, more loving with other people. I mean, man, if I could create a social activism platform based on pleasure alone, kind of what the Pleasure Project is doing, I do think that that sort of work would create a happier society, a more connected society, a more joyful society. But maybe I'm dreaming kind of big here. I don't know.
I think I'd love to say in like 20 years' time we will be a more open society, but I think there's still the part of society that is fighting against it. And as awful as it is, seems to be winning these conversations at times. We seem to be getting stifled and censored more rather than becoming more of a free society. And you shouldn't be ashamed of like your kinks, your fetishes, and things like that. We should just be allowed to be who we are, unless it's illegal. It should be fine. If someone likes playing with balloons, for example, it's fine. Let's just go with it. We
Yeah.
just need to be more tolerable. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, creating that space for authentic expression, I think that's just not, we don't have enough space for that in the world in general, let alone when you talk about sex, let alone when you talk about people with disabilities. It gets, all these added intersectional layers to it and the ways that our society is restricting our authentic expression. And even the word legal, I like to push back on, right? Because like back in the day, interracial, at least depending in America,
Yes.
interracial marriage was illegal, right? All these other pieces. So I'm even like the illegal. It's tricky. I don't want to walk myself into a hole by talking about that, right? Like, I don't want to say anything bad. This one's like, Nicole's endorsing illegal activity. My God,
Yeah.
but like consent culture in that way. But the war on drugs is where I'm always like, the illegal nature is so messed up. I do psychedelic assisted psychotherapy right now for my clinicals. So I'm always like pushing on that forefront too there of, what psychedelics look like and that whole legal battle.
Yeah. And I speak like to so many people having the conversations about CBD and cannabis
Yeah.
and like you say, using like mushrooms and things like that. And I think again, we need to have these conversations. I was like growing up quite anti-drugs.
Mm,
As you grow up, you outlook changes, and I see how certain drugs help people with disabilities and certain conditions. I have a friend who was prescribed like cannabis for a similar condition to myself and
hmm
things like that. And I think we need to at least be open to these conversations. It might not be for everyone. Same with like I said, same with a kink or a fetish.
Yeah.
Not for everyone, but it's for someone.
hmm
And we've got to be, I said, as long like it's hard, like you said, the
I
illegal.
know.
It's obviously things very illegal, so we just like, yes, that shouldn't be discussed and can't be condoned. Especially like in the USA, obviously it's different states as well.
Right. Right.
Where in the
Real
UK,
fun.
it's kind of, yeah, where in the UK we can't do it under one law.
Yeah.
But I think if we don't have these at least have the conversations, we can't move forward.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, because always remembering that the legal system is created by humans that have their own bias. That's the tricky piece of this, right?
Yeah,
And so like, and the power that be, I mean, I think my thing I always come back to is like consent, or is everyone consenting to this? Can everyone consent to this? And harm, like being sure not to harm other people in that. And that gets so tricky. But like, yeah, a lot of these things, I'm sure, at least in American society, we're very like racially charged to control groups of people, and there's like a whole long history of that in America. And so, yeah, being able to talk about it, and I think even as someone who's in training to become a clinical psychologist, like there's so much fear to lose your license when you start talking about things like this that cross over that line, and so it gets risky even to have conversations like that. So I'm
yeah,
doing my
and
best to honor them here and
yeah, and
talk about me.
especially in the society we live in now with social media, things can be misconstrued. If you take
Yep.
a second clip from a five
Yep.
second clip out of our
Yeah.
conversation, it's yeah,
Absolutely. Yep. So every day I'm like, this podcast talking about things, talking about my own experience with psychedelics, it's always like a huge risk. So stay with me, folks. I think that we should be able to talk about truth. I think we should be able to talk about our lived experience. I think we should be able to talk about pleasure. I think we should be able to talk about those things. And so that's kind of my ethics system with doing this. And so trying to create that space, we'll see if I lose my license one day. And if that's what I lose it for talking about truly things that brought me expansion in my own psychology and my own connection for people, then that's a worth it journey for me. You know what I mean?
we need to just obviously you've got to have boundaries, you've got to have laws, but there's a big gap in there that we need to be open to at least talk about things. Not always agree with it, not
Yeah.
always disagree, but at least have that conversation so we can. You would have gone back, say, 100 years. The thought of someone with a disability talking about sex in public would have just been completely, probably even going back 20 years. You just don't see it. I know people even who've had their TV careers cancelled because they talked about disability and sex in the sense of like basically they struggle to get work after having them conversations. And that's
Wow.
not going back that far.
Wow.
It's not shocking to me, honestly, because this is the society we live in. I'm
Yeah.
looking at you and like, how do we create a business for all of us rabble-rousers over here who aren't playing that game anymore? Because all of us need to band together and create something.
Yeah, we need to just take a step back. As you grow up, you are kind of taught certain things that this is right, this is wrong. We need that to at least have some sort of cohesion to a point.
Yeah.
What we forget is we are all different. I will have a conversation with you about, say, for example, psychedelics. I will then go and talk to someone else about that and say, I've been talking about magic mushrooms, for example. They will go, but that's illegal, that's wrong. But at least have the conversation and
Yeah.
say, well, actually, I think we should maybe look at this. This
Mm-hmm.
is the reason why. So then, if we have me learning from you to teach someone else, and then they can say why they don't agree with it, I can then think, right, that's maybe a valid point, but
Mm-hmm.
and you just go back and forth. And the more we talk about these things openly, we learn to be open with each other a little bit more. And again, like, stop. We don't all want to agree with each other. Society would be boring. We need to have discussions. We need to have conflict isn't the word, but we need to have disagreement on certain things.
Mm-hmm.
But we need to be open to have that conversation. For example, like you said, if I said to someone, right, as a disabled person, I want to go to a sex club for the first time I want to go. And if someone says, no, you shouldn't be there because you're disabled, I'd want to know why they're trying to tell me that.
Yeah, me too.
I wouldn't want just a no, and I'm a very, I can't stop with a one word answer. So I would want them to tell me why, and I would tell them they were wrong,
Mm-hmm.
probably. But I'd want to at least have that opportunity to tell them why a disabled person should be in a sex club, or should be at least given the chance to be there, why they shouldn't just be stopped.
Yes, you're hitting on something so important is that like conversations can change society. Just being able to sit in that and not necessarily have to come to the same point, but just hear one another. That is, the democratic process that, of the benefit of hearing different points of view, because we're all going to have our own point of view depending on our lived experience, depending on our education and social conditioning, and being able to hear one another in that and honor the lived experience of other people and hold space for disagreement. That's how we get better, by being able to have those conversations, hear one another, and then keep growing through conversations in relationship with people. And it's, part of what makes today's conversation so important, having conversations about sex and disability and the increased need for pleasure for all bodies. Conversations like this, truly, I do believe will change the world.
Hopefully, we can only try. We can only do it. Having a conversation like this is like a small molecule of the whole big thing, but we just need to have these conversations.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much for having this conversation with me. It was so much fun. Where can people find you, connect with your work and everything that you're doing?
At the moment, the best place to find me is on Instagram. My website is currently being built, so the best place to
Fun.
find me is on Instagram at DJW80.
Great.
But any questions about disability, sex education, if they want advice about sex toys, anything like that, just give me a shout.
We're lucky to have you in this world. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah.
If you enjoyed today's episode, then leave us a 5-star review wherever you listen to your podcast. And head on over to modernanarchypodcast.com to get resources and learn more about all the things we talked about on today's episode. I want to thank you for tuning in, and I will see you all next week.